My name is Aaron McLaughlin. As I mentioned, I'm one of the co-owners of Ken Seeley Communities and Intervention 911, and also working towards my licensure as a social worker. So after many years of being in recovery and working with people in recovery, I made a decision to investigate, kind of how I could better serve the population we work with by developing my clinical skills. And I had a really wonderful and amazing experience in school learning how to be a social worker with an emphasis on mental health issues and drugs and alcohol. But one thing school kind of significantly underrepresented was the impact of trauma, particularly in the field of substance abuse, mental health. And as we could see from Dr. Flowers' amazing presentation, pain. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the way in which pain can be influenced by the onset of trauma, whether that's childhood trauma or whether that's being in a car accident, and why that kind of pulling that thing apart, that pain piece apart, can be so challenging. And when he talks about increases in anxiety and depression as a result of pain, when you start to think about them as a complete picture, it makes a lot of sense. So thank you for a fantastic lead-in. I would like to remind everyone, because we are seeing this, the YouTube of the presentation will be available, and I will send my presentation to Crystal so that she can share that with you, and you can get that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I'll probably repeat it 2 or 3 times. So don't worry, you will get all this great information. So, one thing I wanted to do is, first of all, thank kind of some people who have been instrumental in my experience with trauma. And that would be Judy Crane from the Guest House, who has started a program for professionals and therapists who want to be more experienced in dealing with trauma. And she kind of tricks you. And she tricks you by making you do your own work as you learn about different modalities for treating trauma. And so, we're going to talk today about the trauma egg as one of those modalities. And a lot of what I learned was from her. The other person I learned a lot for was my husband and business partner, Ken. He has been instrumental in working with our therapeutic team to deliver the trauma egg experience to our clients. And one of the things I want to touch on in today's presentation is exactly how we do that as a clinician or a trauma professional. How do we look at the trauma egg as an opportunity to push someone's recovery forward? And then how is that work with the family? How can we take those things and use that to examine the family system? We're a big proponent of looking at addiction and mental health issues as a system-oriented approach, and we look at that family system, and that could be family of origin, family of choice, work family, social family, but we really take a very holistic and systems approach, and using the trauma egg can be very effective at better understanding family functioning. So the 2 things I want you to be thinking about as we go through this is, how can I work with people who've experienced trauma using this device? And then how can I apply that to the system that they might come from and understand better how I can support that system in the healing and recovery process? So we'll go ahead and share the screen. Give me 1 second. We'll get that going.
Eric, did Ken ever get that link?
He did.
I just wanted to make sure that it got there.
It did. Slideshow. All right. So, kind of looking at the trauma egg at Ken Seeley's and how we do, cracking down on trauma 1 egg at a time. That was Drew. Thank you for that cute title. And the idea kind of with the trauma egg is we're going to take a little journey on what is trauma. And, many of you are familiar with trauma and understand trauma. But I want to kind of give an insight as to kind of how we frame what trauma may be, because that's an important piece of being able to utilize the trauma egg with clients. You will get many clients who say, I don't really have any trauma. I was one of those. And you will get many people who feel overwhelmed by their trauma and can't begin to even process it. And then you'll get many people who want to dive right in and think, oh my God, I've been waiting to talk to someone about the path that brought me here and how it's informed my life, right? Trauma, can be defined as a deeply disturbing or distressing experience. And like with chronic pain and with pain, people experience things in all different sorts of ways. So what might be traumatic for me may not be traumatic or may be processed in a different way than someone else. So two people can be in a car crash and two people can have different relationships to that experience. It can be the impetus, the traumatic kind of event that launches substance use as a coping strategy to deal with kind of the symptoms of that car accident, or it can be something that someone in a very healthy way is able to process and kind of move through and not be impacted with. So like with pain, we don't take the approach that your trauma is wrong or right. What we do is we take the approach is look back at your life and tell me what experiences changed your feelings. When did you feel distressed? When did you feel disturbed? When did you feel unsafe? When did you feel neglected? And again, we have to be mindful not to judge those experiences and say, that doesn't seem traumatic, because we have to think about our own system for being able to do those. And I'm going to give you a brief example. So, I mentioned, we talk about trauma and everybody can kind of identify with the big T, what we call the big T trauma, being in war, experiencing a fire, having a car crash, watching someone overdose or die. And, one of the things that Dr. Flowers was talking about was the rate of overdose that we're experiencing. And inherent in substance use is, I believe, an increased exposure to trauma. How can people who use substances often find themselves in situations where they may be more prone to traumatic things happening, such as overdose? And that can be something to consider. There could be pre-substance use trauma and post-substance use trauma, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But there's also what we call little t trauma. And little t trauma is anytime you may have felt unsafe, you might have felt distressed, and think of all the times you might have felt unsafe or distressed in your life. That's a lot of times, right? Ken often speaks about, as a child, having the perfect parents, and having no trauma. And as he started to do this work, what he understood was that growing up, there was a lot of bullying that he experienced. And slowly, every day, over time, year after year, going to school and kind of being afraid of what might happen develops, is it a trauma experience? Picture that person who's at war and every morning they wake up, am I going to have to kill someone today? Am I going to be killed? That constant kind of fear can be can put us into our non-verbal kind of reptilian brain, the amygdala, where our fight or flight is, and that can flood our system. And we'll talk a little bit about the brain response, but an example of trauma, and I was thinking about this as I woke up at 3 a.m. this morning, worried about the presentation. Oh my God, is it going to go well? Am I going to be able to appear educated and professional and, all of these things? And I was thinking about, where does that come from? Why do I have that? And was reflecting back on my trauma egg and realized that I have this very specific memory of being in 7th grade. And, one of the ways in which me and my father connected when I was young, there weren't many, but one of the ways we connected was through stamp collecting. He was an avid stamp collector and kind of encouraged and supported me in doing that with him. And it was kind of a thing where, he was much more involved in this than I was, but he kind of brought me along. So it was something I felt special about with stamp collecting. I felt selected, seen. I felt important because it was something important to my dad, and he included me in that. So my relationship to stamp collecting was, I took a lot of pride in it. I took a lot of happiness in it. And I didn't realize it was kind of geeky from the perspective of other seventh graders. And so what happened is in seventh grade, I went to a new high school in which many of the kids who I went to grade school with and were in my neighborhood did not go to. So I was kind of new. I was struggling to make friends. I was dealing at that time with the concept of fitting in. So I was kind of hyper vigilant. I was worried about, is my body giving me away? Do people know I'm anxious? Can people see I'm gay? I started to have those thoughts. Will people like me? Am I smart enough to be here? I went to a high school that had a lot of gifted students in it, and I was fortunate to get put in those classes, but I never felt like I should be in those classes. So I was kind of in this state of hypervigilance. And so we, in seventh grade, had to present on a hobby that we had. And so I said, well, I'm going to present on stamp collecting. And I didn't have much experience with doing presentations at that time. I was, first through six, you don't do a lot of presentations. And my peer group in first through six was people I grew up with in my neighborhood. I spent time with them after school, and I wasn't nervous. So I was very, very nervous for this presentation, like horribly nervous. And so I kind of collected myself, and we'll pretend that, and I apologize, I don't have a fancy background. We just moved, and I didn't want to cause anyone trauma by showing you the beautiful Hawaii background and all the warm weather we've been having for those of you in Texas who've had to endure the past 2 weeks. So I'm using my office, but pretend that this is a chalkboard back here. And so, stamps, they come in really large size sheets. And so I picked, what I thought was the most interesting sheets. I was starting to experience a physical reaction as I was sitting in class. I was starting to get sweaty palms. I could feel a little tightness in my chest. I got that like sick feeling in my gut. And that was my anxiety around presenting, right? And I didn't have a word for it. I started to sweat. I was wearing a wrong shirt. I could see the sweat thing starting in my armpits. And I was horrified that I was going to have to stand up in front of the class. All the cool kids were talking about travel. We grew up very middle class. Our travel was to, New Hampshire to go look at the forest and then drive back home in the same day. Actually, we did have really good vacations as a kid. But up to that point, my perception was I was missing out on all what these rich kids were getting. They talked about travel. They talked about sports. I was as uncoordinated as they come. It was a point of contention for me. They talked about all these really cool hobbies, and I started to feel shame that I liked stamp collecting. So I went up to the board, and I had my little sheet, and I started talking, and my voice sounded like this. And as I put the stamps up, my hand was shaking. I was having a physical anxiety response. And I kept trying to put the stamps onto the board. I got a good thing. There's a ledge on the chalkboard. And if I can put it on there, I won't have to hold it, and I can put my hands on the table in front of me. So I put it on the chalkboard, and it fell off. So then I had to bend over in front of everyone. I picked it up again, shaking. I could hear some chuckles in the class. I put it up on the chalkboard. It fell over again. So my first experience as a public speaker was awful. It was awful. But it wasn't what most people would consider a big T trauma. But what I realized this morning is that has informed my unconscious response that happens every time I present. I have a trauma response. My palms get sweaty, I get a sick feeling, and my crazy brain starts to think you're not good enough, you can't do this, you're going to disappoint, people are not going to think well about you. And the good thing is now I have years of experience seeing the flip side of that. Okay, Eric, I can use my CBT skills. You can see, is this a realistic, is this kind of a real response to be having? No, you've gotten good feedback on doing presentations. You're You can put two sentences together. You can present helpful information. You're okay. So I have a coping strategy that's much better than the anxiety. But what I'm experiencing is actually a trauma response. The patterns and the storing of that trauma, that fight or flight, that what are we going to do kind of thing pops up every time I have to present. It is like clockwork. It happens all the time. And so part of what we want to talk about is being mindful of that, but also kind of noticing what are the patterns that come up as someone is discussing the trauma. And we'll talk about that in just a second. So a little bit about kind of what does happen with trauma. And we're kind of looking at this in a childhood trauma, but trauma is a lifelong experience. Trauma can happen at any point along the developmental process. And if you're not familiar with the ACE study, Adverse Childhood Effects, please take a look at that. It can really kind of give you insight as to how people's development can be impacted and result in all sorts of issues that come up for people. But I would really want to kind of point out kind of talking about the three centers of the brain: the amygdala, which is kind of the reptilian center, the fear center, the fight or flight, the thing that protects us in our lives, which we don't even have to think about, the things that happen automatically. A lot of trauma response creates an overactive amygdala, which means that your body is flooding with hormones, with stress hormones, and your body is in a constant state of hypervigilance. And what happens is that can become the dominating thing that happens anytime we're confronted with a flight or flight. So we may not have access to the underactivated pieces of the brain, which develop with executive functioning and emotions and feeling. So this can be a real challenging thing. And it's a lot of times why people talk about experiential and non-talk therapy as a way to mitigate trauma for people. When we are in our amygdala and in our reptilian brain, it is not there's not a rational kind of thought there. It's not a word-based approach. It's not a cognitive functioning. It transcends language. It transcends the active consciousness that we would expect out of an adult who is functioning and able to process things in a normal way. Trauma can impact depression, anxiety. It can be co-occurring when there is a pain issue. That trauma can cause some of what Dr. Flowers was talking about in terms of kind of almost like intensifying the pain and creating more pain and perception of more pain in people. It's very, I always take the approach, and this is something that I learned from Judy, is we're not looking to kind of necessarily say to figure out kind of what causes the trauma. What we're trying more to do is talk about how do we change the way in which we respond to similar events now than we did when we were traumatized, right? We can understand where the trauma came from. We can tell the story, right? We can look at, I was a young kid. I grew up in a two-parent household. I was provided for. I didn't suffer from feeling neglect, what I would describe as neglect. I had a traumatic experience at 13, losing my father. He died of a heart attack not in front of me, but I witnessed kind of my mother performing CPR on him. And my response was to disassociate, right? You can have a lot of losses as a result of the trauma. You can have a loss of self-worth, a loss of sense of self, a loss of physical connectedness to the body, a loss of intimacy, a loss of trust, a loss of danger cues, and a loss of safety. And for me, as that 13-year-old, I really developed a disconnect between kind of emotional understanding as well as physical understanding. I kind of locked into that. And there's a great book, Crystal, I'll make sure she has the title, but The Body Knows the Score. by by Bessel van der Kolk. The Body Keeps the Score, by Bessel van der Kolk. And what that states is that trauma lives on in the body. It lives on in the neural pathways that are developed in the brain. It lives on in the effect of our stress response and how that impacts our body and functioning. It can create pain. It can create tightness. It can create that feeling in your gut. And there's a lot of studies that show that an approach to treating trauma that allows for the unlocking of that unconscious response and multiple pathways to kind of experience or to re-experience or to release that are very powerful. Yoga, massage, somatic experience, experiential activities like the trauma egg. Those are all really good ways to deal with trauma. So on to the trauma egg. So Marilyn Murray had kind of an overarching sense of the role of trauma in human beings' well-being. And it wasn't a substance abuse approach, but it was an approach that kind of lent itself to looking at what has happened in our life, and then what were the ways in which we responded to it? How did we cope with it? What were the strategies we put in place? Because oftentimes an individual who experiences trauma doesn't have the coping strategies or the ability to process or deal with that in a healthy way. Maybe they have low resilience as a result of a high ACE score. Maybe their resilience hasn't developed. Maybe their protective factors aren't there for them. So there's lots of different ways. I know this is a little blurry on your screen, and I'm going to send this attachment. So for those of you who are requesting the presentations, this attachment will be separate, included in that. But this is kind of what we give to our clients so that they can begin the process of developing and creating the trauma egg. And so, when do we do a trauma egg? Obviously, we want our clients to be somewhat stable, meaning that we want them to be detoxed. We want them to be engaging in recovery. We want them to be working with therapists, working with a case manager, working with a family advocate. And what we see a lot of is that people who come for mental health and substance abuse issues have a difficult time with emotional regulation. They're oftentimes dysregulated. They don't have a lot of skills for coping with. Now that drugs and alcohol become their coping skills, right? That's a huge coping skill. And that's why there's such a significant tie to trauma as a contributing factor to substance abuse. We can look and try and figure out, where did this come from? Why is Bobby abusing drugs and alcohol? And I think that this is even a fair way to look at those people who transition from or who are prescribed medications and are more susceptible. Trauma can make us more vulnerable to reaching for things that make us feel better, because we're constantly in a state of emotional dysregulation. And I think that's a human experience. I don't think that that's necessarily, you have to have trauma to experience that. But when we look at trauma through the lens of anytime you felt unsafe, anytime you felt a disconnect or fear, that can give us, that can bind us in that kind of experience of what it's like to be human. That's a natural feeling for most people to feel. I haven't met many people who haven't experienced something that I think would qualify for trauma. So a couple people asked who's the Judy I'm referencing. Her name is Judy Crane. She has a facility down in Florida called the Guest House. She's been a leader in trauma work for many years, and I've been very fortunate to do some training with her on becoming a certified trauma therapist. So developing tools to work with people in trauma, understanding trauma, and how to do that. So the trauma egg is kind of 5 different steps or clusters. What you do is you provide a piece of paper, you provide colored markers, colored crayons. I will say there's no wrong way to do a trauma egg, but there are certain things that you want to communicate as being integral to the trauma egg process. So what we look at is, again, going back to our family approach that we use at KSC, is we want to understand kind of the family system and family functioning, because that will play an important role into future growth and future development of coping skills and coping strategies. So what are the family roles? What are the unspoken rules or messages? So an unspoken rule or message, and if my mom, my aunt, my sister here, it's great to see you. Thanks for being here to support me. If you're not here and watching on the rewind, hello. But they focus primarily on unspoken rules. And one of the unspoken rules in my house was we have to appear good, right? No matter what's going on. We want to be educated. We want to be financially secure. We want to be respectful. And that was a rule that my family had. As we also want to take a look at family roles. What was your family role? Mine was a little bit the peacekeeper. I wanted to make everybody or the mascot is sometimes the term that's used. I wanted to make everyone happy. I wanted to smooth things over. I wanted to diffuse any tension. And this particularly became an issue when after my father died, kind of with my mother and my sister, they struggled at times to get along. And that was very distressing to me, right? So my goal was, how do I fix this? How do I fix this? How do I fix this? How do I keep everything levity? And kind of how I've developed, kind of a sense of humor as a first line defense to any stressful situation. My first thing is, how can I make someone laugh? Rather than kind of look inward. In the bottom two corners, we want to put in kind of our paternal role caregiver was, and then in the right-hand corner, what are some characteristics of our maternal caregiver? So for some people, they didn't grow up with a mom or a dad, but they may have had someone who functioned in this role, and just kind of words to describe their personality. You want them to include both positive and negative. This is a key piece and insight, again, into the family functioning. What we can see when we talk about trauma, we talk about the transgenerational transmission. Or intergenerational transmission. And it's really a big kind of thing when for those of you who've ever done a genogram, as an interventionist and as a family therapist and as someone who values the family systems, genograms can kind of unlock patterns within family systems that are, that go beyond kind of the initial or nuclear family system, grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents. And what we can see when we look at that is we can see the trauma history throughout the family system. So when we look at the roles that mom and dad play, we do that with an eye towards how suitable, how resilient, what protective factors did they have in place to either prevent further trauma, to ignore trauma, or, and I don't mean this, I don't want to take this in a wrong way, or to facilitate even more trauma. And a lot of times trauma can be, again, we talked about how a person receives something, and a lot of times caregivers have been traumatized themselves and they don't know how to do something that isn't transmitting that trauma further. So we can gain some really good insight as to the perception of the person doing the trauma egg, as to how their primary caregivers were. And then we get to the kind of the meat and the potatoes of the trauma egg, and that's what goes on the inside. So if you remember earlier, I talked a little bit about what the kind of unconscious and nonverbal kind of piece the amygdala plays, that fight or flight, that trauma response that many people have. The idea of using pictures is to kind of tap into that kind of nonverbal functioning in the brain, and to kind of unlock kind of some of the memories that come. You remember I talked about a loss of ability sometimes to be connected. A loss of memory can be a piece. And the drawing is hopefully gives them some tools to be able to unlock that. And you start from the bottom of the egg up. And what you do is you put your earliest memories in which you felt distressed, which you felt unsafe, which you were hurt, which there was physical harm, maybe there was sexual abuse, maybe there was you did not want to participate in something and you were forced to participate in that. You can even include pre-birth events, kind of at the bottom below the egg. And one kind of the interesting things that, kind of I learned is I went through my trauma egg as well as my genogram as part of my own personal work and recovery, and things that we do as, kind of interventionists and family therapists is I learned that there was a lot of financial stress in my family, in particular when I was being born. My mom had a lot of fear about, and I hope, Mom, you don't mind that I'm sharing all this. So she's a wonderful woman. She was an amazing mom. She took really good care of me and my sister. And there was a lot of financial stress leading up to my birth, wondering, how am I going to survive? I'm not working. I'm totally reliant on this other person. We have totally different ideas about money and how that should be used and managed. So there was a lot of financial stress, and that was kind of a pattern that existed in a multi-generational family system of immigrant families, kind of having no resources, living through the Depression. Do you talk about money? Do you not talk about money? And those things were repeating themes that repeated in my family system. We struggled a lot after my father died financially. I was horrified to think that my family qualified for food stamps, and thank God we did. At that time, my mom made a really great decision to go back. My mom is like the smartest person I know. And what she did was she realized, I've lost my husband. I have 2 young kids. I want them to go to college. I need to support them. She was a nurse at the time. She worked the overnight. She was a head RN, very successful. And she said to herself, I'm going to have to do something different where I can support my family, myself. And at 40, I think 42 or 43 years old, she went back to law school, and she graduated to become a lawyer. She worked at some really amazing, top-notch law firms doing really amazing work as a lawyer, very successful second career, and that resiliency that she had, some of that was a result of the trauma she experienced as a kid. And she helped in me develop many protective factors to be able to kind of move forward in my own life, which has just been amazing. So that that intergenerational, looking at pre-birth, what was going on kind of as you were born. And then you level up. You go from maybe 0 to 3 years, 3 years to 6 years, 6 years to 10 years. And you kind of put picture representations of what that trauma was. And again, it's always what that trauma was to you. You can see here some more kind of some of those pieces, what is something you heard a lot growing up? What were family boundaries like? Family rules, family roles. And then kind of the details of what happens in the egg. Any event that was traumatic, abusive, involved in abandonment, or where you felt or were powerless. That's a really powerful one for people, where they felt powerless. And it doesn't mean that they had a terrible outcome. It doesn't mean that something ended up badly, but that in that moment, feeling powerless, what was that for? And you want to get a really good context of as much as they can remember. And my own personal experience with the trauma egg is that I had my first draft, or my first run through, was significantly lacking in multiple things. One of the, I had finished the trauma egg and again was kind of dialing back to that presentation. And I remembered, kind of that concern about when I might be judged by others. And I remember, I'll use the term, it flooded back to me almost literally. In second grade, the teacher had said, I'm going to be teaching now. There are going to be no more questions or interruptions from anyone. And my family rule was, you are respectful of adults, you excel in school, and you don't cause problems. So as she was lecturing in the second grade, I had to go to the bathroom. And so I sat there and I wrestled with the fact, do I tell her? Do I get up and go? Do I raise my hand? And what kept playing for me was that unconscious family message of, we respect our teachers, we don't cause problems, we do what we're told. And what she told us was to stay seated. And sure enough, about 20 minutes into that lecture, I wet my pants. I was mortified, horrified In fact, to this day, I don't remember exactly what happened. I remember ending up in the nurse's station. I think they called my mom. I think I got a change of clothes or left home early. I can't really remember, what happened after that. But that feeling of horror of, oh my God, I'm disappointing everyone. I'm disappointing the family. And now I'm vulnerable because I've done something that 8-year-old boys don't do. You don't pee your pants. So a lot of shame and guilt, and that's informed that kind of feeling of, I get anxious, I get nervous still today when I don't feel 100% confident in bringing something up or bringing something forward. And it's interesting to see how, after doing that trauma egg, that's informing. Crystal, do we have a question?
We've had a few pop up. I've made some notes, but I was just giving you a 10-minute warning.
All right, perfect. We're right on time. Awesome. So now what I feel could be most beneficial is what do you do? Here we have some trauma eggs. These are some clients, and you can see across the trauma eggs the differences in the way people present that. A lot of them use the shape. Someone did a more structured analysis, with their pictures. That middle one is Ken's, he is very open about his own family history and how those things impacted him. But you can see the ones on the right and the left have a different style, the use of colors. And there's a lot of, it's really fun to see how people take this on. And some people even go beyond doing an egg. They use different shapes. I've seen people use crosses. I've seen people use coffins, all different types of shapes. And we want to encourage creativity. The one thing we don't allow is for people to use words and write. We would send someone back to the drawing board. We really want them to tap into that visual kind of medium. So these are some sample trauma eggs. Just a brief reminder for those of you who may not have been listening, we will share this presentation. Crystal will send it out, and you will have the directions to the trauma egg that we can send to you as an attachment. How do we use the trauma eggs to help our clients? And I've talked a little bit about unlocking some insight into family functioning. But one thing is, we got to remember that this person is sharing with them their experiences. And what we don't want to do is revel in the actual experience. What we want to hear is, how did they respond? If someone ends up at our treatment center, it's a good chance that they have a significant drug and alcohol issue or a significant mental health issue. And if they've used drugs and alcohol as a coping strategy for the pain, for the emptiness, for the hurt, for the disappointment that they feel as a result of an underlying trauma, they've been very successful at coping with that pain. Many, many people who experience trauma end up killing themselves because they don't have a way to cope with that pain. And drugs and alcohol are a very accessible, very, there's no, when people use that as a solution, I can understand why it becomes difficult to stop using drugs and alcohol. When your only relief from what you're feeling, and you don't even know what's causing that feeling. Imagine blacking out a memory that's stored in your amygdala, that doesn't have words, that's flooding your body with stress hormones. Every time you see something related to that event, but you don't know it's related to that event. Imagine how distressing that would feel. And then you take a sip of beer, or you smoke a joint, or you are given a pain pill. Imagine the relief that comes from feeling that. And so what happens is people develop a hustle or a response to deal with that underlying emotional issue. And that's really what we're looking for. What are the coping strategies? What are the skills? What are the things that they've put in place? And this is really, when I talked about learning from Judy, this is where I've really learned from Ken, is he's super, super perceptive at this. And he's learned to be able to listen to the story and identify the underlying themes that are popping up. Where are the themes? Where are the coping strategies? Where are the behaviors coming into place? And then how can we develop an awareness of our own emotional state when we're dysregulated, and then use those coping strategies, but in a healthier manner that's more recovery oriented, right? And Dr. Flowers talked about all those really great interventions, from mindfulness to CBT skill development, to DBT skills, to emotional regulation. All of those things are things that we would want to provide our clients in an effort to kind of come up with new coping strategies. But what I find is that people who make it through to the doorway to recovery are already imbued with resilience. They found a way to survive, and it may not have always been the best way to survive, now that they have an awareness of what they did and maybe how that hasn't been as healthy as possible. But the fact that they survived is a testament. I watch these trauma eggs and I get so overwhelmed when I look at what people have endured, and the fact that they're here today means that they have all the tools already. And what I'm giving them is just additional tools. What I'm giving them is, additional ways to be able to continue to work, but they've already got it. And that's that hustle. And, sometimes people say, how can you use your powers for good? And I don't
want to create more trauma for you.
I often worry when I mention Ken that he likes me to say things a certain way. So this could be traumatic for me, him coming in the middle of my presentation. But no, what did you want to say?
Yeah, no, I love it what you're talking about, because the trauma that people go through is, when you do the genogram and you do the trauma egg, you're able to see, we just did a training this past weekend, and Caroline Smith, that's part of our trainings, she had a picture of a tree with a beautiful house on top of, on this property. And underneath it was all the roots. And so that was all the family's hustle, their traumatic experiences that are brought up to their offsprings. And so when you do a trauma egg, you're able to see that hustle, like mine, that hustle. And that hustle has been rooted in their family tree for so many generations that's the problem. And everybody, when they go to treatment, it's the identified person's problem. It's the identified person's problem. But in all reality, it's a family system problem.
100%.
And that's what I love about what Eric's been doing in our treatment center. Every Tuesday, he does a family group therapy session where the family gets into treatment, because the trauma is so intense with the identified person, but the family members had their trauma. And if we could treat the whole family, then we're making headway in creating a safer and a healthier environment for the system instead of just the individual.
Yeah, so it's point on, and you kind of already did the last slide, which is gaining clinician takeaway is, we have the case manager, we have the therapist, we have Ken, we'll have the family advocate all sit in on the trauma egg, and even we'll invite the family to participate if that's appropriate. And it is such a gift to that system, and to be able to kind of take a multidisciplinary approach across different ways to ensure that we're being trauma informed, we're treating them with care and respect, but we're also challenging them to find new ways of functioning is really important. And my family session on Tuesdays at 5 p.m. Pacific is open to everybody. You do not have to be a family at KSC to participate. But we'd love to see you there. I'll get Crystal the information on that. And I'd love to, I just have one more slide for some, just talking about the family approach. From intervention to treatment to aftercare, the trauma-informed piece in that. Please, kind of keep that in mind. Our motto is, be clear it's a year, and we involve the family system from the start. So anytime we get to partner with other individuals who are providing great care, we love to do that. And here's some contact information for me, and I'm sure Crystal will share that. And would love to leave a little bit of time for some questions.
Yeah, thank you. I know that Tonda is more familiar with your trauma egg stuff and has told me how amazing it is, but I haven't personally got to see it. So it was very interesting. I did write down a couple of questions. There were several different ones that popped up, but I wrote down a couple that I thought were maybe important. So someone said, can you clarify something? Is suggesting that miscarriages are consequences and results of trauma? Like, is that okay? I guess they're saying, is that okay?
Yeah, I don't know that I would say that a miscarriage is a result or cause of trauma, although significant trauma can lead to health issues. But for sure, having a miscarriage could be perceived by the person as a traumatic experience that impacts them. So for sure.
Someone also asked how to get more. I thought this was really important because I think a lot of people want to know this. How they could get more information on the trauma egg.
Yeah, so there's a lot of good resources online. You can also call me. We're trying. We've been thinking. For professionals who work in the field, oftentimes we become the helper, and we could still benefit from the help. So we're coordinating with Lauren and Caroline about how we might be able to offer this to professionals, kind of in a 6-week rolling course. But certainly, you can reach out and find a certified trauma therapist or certified trauma professional who may be able to help you kind of experience that. It's by no means a be all and end all to resolving trauma, but the windows that it opens and insight that you gain can be unbelievable. Even just watching one, not even doing it yourself.
And then we'll do this one more that I think is super important. They asked, is the trauma egg done individually? Can it be done in a group? And then about how long does it take to complete?
Yeah, that's a great question. And Rasa, who just put something in the chat, we see you. Don't worry, everyone will get a copy of this presentation, Dr. Flowers' presentation, our contact information.
You don't have to request it. I'm going to send it to everybody.
Yeah, if you signed up, you're going to get the CEs too. It's just a wonderful thing. So they take care of everything. So thank you, Crystal. I believe I'm a big fan of group therapy. And this was, thank you for asking that, because it is one thing I left out. We always do them in a group setting. And the reason for that is because what that offers an opportunity is it's kind of like that two-way dynamic that happens in group therapy. One, the participant or witness to the trauma egg can give you can give the person who's doing the trauma egg some feedback. Wow, I really identified with how you dealt with when you were sexually abused, because I was sexually abused too. So there can be some connection, there could be some shame reduction. All of those things can be a benefit. The other thing is that it can really kind of open up a discussion about some really difficult or painful things that people often are shy about talking about. And whether that's because they feel that they're the only one or they feel that it's not appropriate, it gives permission for some really to dig deep and allow people to feel confident in bringing that stuff up. We always do them in a group setting. Anything else to add on the group dynamic?
And the feedback that the individual gets from their peers is so powerful. So yeah, that's a really good question. I don't really agree in doing them alone with one-on-one with someone. I think the group is really the only way to get the fullest out of what the experience could be for the individual.
Thank you.
Great job.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you again to Dr. James Flowers and Eric McLaughlin for this amazing continuing education presentation. If you would like to be added to our CEU emailing list, please email ceu@kemapalms.com. Thank you for tuning in, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. See you again soon.